want to make a couple of comments. Firstly, I've known Sandy from the ISPO, where she has provided us a lot of valuable and good service over the years. And last year I was impressed with the meeting here. Little did I know that I'm going to be called again. But with hashtag #IsPower activities, I wish that there was more of these activities around the world. We do need this. It's not advocating ISPO. It is advocating prosthetics and orthotics. And that's the important bit that people should know. Secondly, before I get onto this, 10 minutes ago, I met Harold Shangali's daughter-in-law here. And for those who don't know, Harold Shangali is a past president of ISPO, and actually he's the one who called me about 10 years ago and said, I'd like you to chair the protocol committee. And that is what started me getting involved at this level. So,
well done.
Third thing, Richard's also here with me, and he will show you the little post-it sticker about us talking about this, I hope he does, about this some 20 years ago on comfort, appearance, and function. And it's wonderful to come back here and see that first thing I see is this triangle over here. And the other important thing is that, okay, it's one, yes, I'm pleased it generated discussions. But when Colin this morning in his presentation talked about his triangle being different, I think that's the real application, that people realize, the users realize that you can't get all three, they won't be equal, or they may be slightly different shape for different prostheses, and that really was the aim. So I'm actually delighted at what I've seen during the last year here in Port Her. I was asked to talk on building confidence and well-being in response to disability. Gosh, in my 30 years of speaking, I think that's probably the most difficult topic I've ever had, because it's so general, and yet in a way it is critical, because at the end of the day that's what the user wants. See, if you think in terms of disability, I started thinking, gosh, what can I say about this? Disability is the disadvantage, and if you think of the word disadvantage, perhaps you should also think or extrapolate from other conditions where there is a disadvantage, and people have to work through that disadvantage. What about the glass ceiling that women talk about in companies? That's a disadvantage. What about race and color and religion? That can be a disadvantage. And yet, to succeed, all those people have had to build their confidence. And it may well be that a lot of the answers are in those aspects of getting confidence and well-being. If you go to, this is a picture of a part of the bookshelf in Waterstones in Kingston. And they are all self-help books on confidence. A lot of them do with business and work and public speaking and so on. But there is masses and masses written on confidence and self-help books. How many self-help books have people come across to help people who have lost limbs? I'm sure there must be some. I'm only aware of one, and I do not normally, even in my clinic, I do not advocate that specific book simply because it appears if I'm selling, but in this audience just because we have come to it from a different angle. And that's the book written by Karen Fisher, who's been a joint author in a lot of the research work we've done. almost certainly the psychologist with the most experience, with about 30 years experience in looking after people following limb loss. She was a consultant psychologist at Stanmore, worked with me. But there's so much on other aspects of building confidence. So what is confidence? Dictionary would say, yes, it's a noun, and it means the feeling or belief that one can have faith in or rely on someone or something. Like, if it's a third person, we had every confidence in the staff. And the lower bit is just synonyms, so I wouldn't go into it in detail, but it's about, you can talk about it as trust, belief, faith, and so on and on. So this is confidence. But the topic, of course, includes well-being, which is where perhaps health comes in a bit more. Well-being is defined as the state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy. In other words, an improvement in the patient's well-being. And this is what I suggested may actually influence comfort, or comfort may influence this. It's really a two-way process. Last year, I gave two definitions of comfort. A state of physical ease and freedom from pain or constraint, which is more clinical, relating to the stump and the socket itself. And I'm delighted that my colleague Richard's also here, and I leave him to talk about the practical and the clinical applications of that. And the other was the easing or alleviation of a person's feelings of grief and distress. And that, of course, makes you wonder, gosh, am I really the person who should be speaking here? Or should it be a psychologist with the appropriate experience? And the fact that I've been in this clinical practice trying to advocate the other part of well-being and health and rehabilitation and habilitation, etc. Then I thought maybe it's an opportunity for me to air a few of the views that I've had and picked up over the last 30 years. None of what I'm going to say is going to be relevant or going to relate to any specific individual. There might all be exceptions. So I apologize in advance if anybody feels that I'm getting at anybody personally. I gave this example of the ballerina's feet. Awful feet. But what we see is just the top left-hand picture. Very attractive, very pretty, ghastly feet underneath. And I also said that they never complain. Actually they do, but when they complain, they are normally about 40, and it's towards the end of their career when perhaps the symptoms that they ignored when they were young and aspiring, successful ballerinas suddenly becomes relevant. They're not as successful, and question mark, are they somatizing their failure or their waning career with paying more attention to symptoms that might always have been there, but been of less relevance? And that is what psychologists would call somatization. Or, of course, Lawrence of Arabia, who said the trick is not minding that it hurts. But you cannot mind only if you are successful in other aspects that takes your mind away, distracts, or that's your main interest. And therefore, one should not forget that the whole process of rehabilitation is not just the one clinical matter, but the person as a whole. Let's look at what confidence might mean. Success, most important of course, is success and belief in yourself. You have to believe in yourself, because if you don't believe in yourself, you could jolly well ask, why should others do? Others may, if they are your teachers and your parents and your advocates, they would believe in that, and then they will try and transfer that onto you in a way to give you extra confidence. But at the end of the day, it's the individual themselves who must have a belief in themselves and what they are doing. You could also say that confidence is a question of overcoming fear of failure. And it's really because you fear the consequences of not achieving something that prevents you from managing to get what you may want and the confidence that you may have. And I know that psychologists, and I'm not a psychologist, but I work very closely with one, they also have a system where if somebody is worried about something, they say, well, what worries you about this? And they may say that, oh, I won't walk straight. And the next question, well, so what if you don't walk straight? And the person said, oh, well, such and such a person will make fun of me, or I will not get the job. So, yes, so what? And by going on so what, so what, so what to a lot of questions, ultimately comes out that the last one, it really doesn't matter. Whatever the last outcome was, it doesn't matter. So there are ways in which psychologists and counselors will try and help you overcome fear of failure, positive thinking, and I'll show you a slide later about positive thinking. Encouragement, I've already mentioned, and not just a third person like parents and teachers and clinicians and psychologists and all trying to encourage you, but you need to encourage yourself also. What is important is that you must have realistic goals, and people often come and tell me in the clinic that I can't do X or Y. I said, yes, but I can't run a marathon. Actually, I can't even run a 2-mile race. But it doesn't bother me. And you've got to realize that you are quite different from somebody else, and everybody would have different goals. I've got 3 children, and all 3 are different. First one can't do what the second one does, but they are all different. And you have different aspirations and different goals, but whatever you set for yourself, obviously, has to be the correct one. And this is where the clinical practice of goal setting in amputee rehab, I think fails if they are made to set goals in the beginning, because they don't know what to expect. So there are various therapists and teams that say, okay, rehab is goal setting, so on day 1 you set a goal. The person just had an amputation, and his goal would be to get back to exactly what he wanted. He doesn't know the rest yet, so it has to be realistic, and you've got to be honest to yourself in there, and not just think of the prosthesis as the only form of treatment, because it's only a part of the overall treatment. Just finished reading an excellent PhD thesis of somebody for an upper limb, well, quite the students from Netherlands. The whole thesis, probably deserving a cum laude, is about all other aspects of treatment of upper limb, hardly mentions. And you would then see that upper limb prosthetics alone is only 10% of the rehabilitation of somebody with upper limb loss. And yet, sometimes the person will come and say, I've lost the arm, I think I need one of those super fancy prostheses, as if that's going to be the answer. So it has to be realistic. You have to understand the other person, the other view. And I put it very broadly as other view. The other view could be what your clinician's view is, what the society's view is, and that, okay, the person can't do A, B, and C because of some other reason. There may be a justified reason, not necessarily because X doesn't want to give you whatever they do. And therefore you need to have a correct attitude towards the public prejudice and be positive and not let that affect you. Now these are some, it's not an exhaustive list, but it highlights, and after all, the first slide I showed you were bookshelves full of books on this, but there's a lot in there. In Scotland, home of golf, I think people might just recognize this, which is the Masters final in Augusta in 1996, where that is Greg Norman on the left, who started the day leading by 5 strokes on the final day in Augusta. And by evening, lost to Nick Faldo by 5 strokes. What happened? They're both champions in their own right. After all, he was leading by 5 going into the 4th day. Probably one of the best examples of complete loss of confidence on day 5, on day 4. Complete loss of confidence. There's nothing else that can explain it. It is probably the single in golf, in major history, I think it's probably the single example of the worst collapse on the last day, as people I suppose will say. The English cricket team has been doing a lot of that in India, but this is an example given. And when you look at confidence, you come across so many books on golf, say you can imagine the shot where it's going, and you have a positive approach. Oh gosh, I hope I don't go into the rough here. Whereas you're sure to go to the rough if you think that way, but if you go, okay, that's the hole, it's going to go there. This is what they talk about. But of course, that's also led to a lot of sports psychology. You remember Andy Murray when he was in a down, sitting there he took out a little slip of paper from his bag, sitting at Wimbledon, probably all encouraging notes given to him, reading to self-motivate himself. Sampras did the same. Of course, the nasty TV cameraman took pictures and tried to home in on exactly what those words were. But there is a major, every professional sports person has a sports psychologist these days. They're good at their work, it's just that marginal differences. And confidence is extended well beyond just limb loss. And therefore I would say, participation in itself, the success of rehabilitation should not be measured, or should be measured, with successful participation in whatever you wanted to do. And that has to be realistic. Of course, this also fits into the ICF classification of, WHO classification of impairment, disability, and handicap, which now is impairment, function, and participation. So looking positive at whatever the outcome is, you look towards it and be involved in all this. One of the biggest problems that many of us have in clinical practice is when a patient comes in and says, I want this leg or that knee. And you find, okay, we only just started. They are fixated on the prescription. You don't go to a GP and say, look, I want teicoplanin as the antibiotic. You go with this problem. And then you set things up in some way and decide what's the most appropriate. But when somebody is fixated on the prescription, whether it's a C leg or whether it's just a flexible knee, it becomes difficult for the person more, but also our task has to start differently. I had a 72-year-old man who came, he had a pre-amp consultation with me, so I'd seen him before the amputation at Stanmore, and then we didn't think he'd walk with a free knee at all. And he was also very fond of clay pigeon shooting. And at the age of 72, but fairly unwell and a high amputation, we advised a locked knee. And he said, no, but I want to be able to walk with a free knee. And then you play it gently rather than say, no, out of the question. No, he said, well, we can look at it later, but let's start like this. However, I think you might find that when you do go clay pigeon shooting, you're walking on rough ground and so on, your stiff locked knee will be far more helpful than anything else. And a year later when I saw him, he says, yes, you are right. But it does involve, and I think rather than say, no, this is what you have, you've got to explain it all to them. And that is what I tend to call the ritual of consultation. Somatization is when a person gets fixated to a certain body symptom or part or whatever it may be. And before giving examples in our field, a simpler form of somatization may be that somebody's got O levels or GCSEs or A level, some exams coming or something stressful, and starts getting a pain here. And it happens every time an exam's coming. And it can, hopefully it can get nipped in the bud. We explain, look, all it is, rather than just discarding it as nothing, you explain to the person that, look, what it is that you are a little tense, and if you're a little tense, your muscles are contracting, but what you need to do is relax them. Rather than do x-rays or investigations and if you explain to them that, look, this is because you need to relax that, we understand it is inevitable that you're stressed. Explain the whole thing, at least that's the way I address it, and that is somatization too, in the most minor extent. The first time I actually saw a significant somatization was a 15-year-old boy who fell off a motorcycle. His arm went there, his neck went there, and clinicians here will know that that causes a brachial plexus injury. He was sent to us 6 months later, still not recovered, but in those 6 months he had all the investigations done for the brachial plexus. He'd seen Rolf Birch and all these top shots for brachial plexus, and the nerve conduction studies showed full, proper nerve communication going from here to here. Nothing wrong with the nerves, yet he could not lift his arm up. That is an extreme case of somatization. And how do you treat it? You treat it, it took about 6 to 9 months of saying, yes, you've got to do exercises,